Art has been a part of human history for as long as, well, humans have existed. The need to express oneself in a medium that lasts beyond them is something interesting to analyze and attempt to understand. Now, art is also often a marker of what was important at the time it was made, whether it be through subjects depicted or what kind of paint was used. The time machine that is looking at art is truly fascinating to admire. The move into the modern age, known generally as the late mid-1800s to the 1970s, was not a sudden one, with the movements leading up to it kind of working in this cyclical wheel of change and returns to norms that seem to happen within many art movements. And modernism was a natural effect of the causes of the change and revolution that were happening in the world. And in this sense of newness, of novelty, of a world without a doubt that likely felt so different for those living in it, this created new movements, especially within art, like Expressionism. Before we fully jump into Expressionism, let's first cover modernism and kind of break down what that means. So, modernism, although a large and multifaceted topic, is at its core the philosophy of an era of change that was based within capitalism and consumerism's rise during the industrial revolutions that were happening in the world. It was a movement that celebrated science and technology, the things that were invented and suddenly made living life a lot easier. It encouraged leisure because, well, you don't really have to plant your own food. You live in a city where you can simply buy it. This often made modernism a core of representing and celebrating progress and novelty. It highlighted the power of consumption in an unprecedented way, and often did this, however, at the expense of the worker, at the expense of people, as they were expected to climb higher and higher and higher in their ladders of their respective careers and lives. A strange but telling juxtaposition to the ideas of leisure and what it meant to people. In short, modernism, at least how I'll speak of it here, is kind of just this movement into the capitalist society that we know pretty well today. What this meant to art is displayed in countless movements and sub-movements and sub-movements of sub-movements that were inspired by this great change, as often art was a method of criticism, of personal expression on behalf of one's own personal loss or of a greater societal loss due to the nature of the destruction and excesses of modernism's grip on society. Modernism in art meant a change in representation, a change in what could and should and what was even attempted to be portrayed. A large reason for a lot of changes in styles of art, especially painting, were caused by the modernist invention of photography, for example. This technological revolution of how we captured moments in time made it so that portraiture and realism in art suddenly became, at best, frivolous and at worst, almost seen as a waste. This, almost as a side effect of modernism, created ages of art that displayed itself as art. Long gone was the time that art was made to be realistic to the eye, because a photo, which was far less expensive and time-consuming anyway, could achieve the exact same effect. So, art of the many eras before, for example, any court painter's work, was no longer popular as it had far less use. And what had no use in capitalist society simply dies under the rules of consumption and the expectation around it. However, rather than stunting the creation of art, often some of the best art came out of a sense of revolt against popular society, and in many ways, how modernism impacted art was by art fighting against modernism. Abstract art with new ways of displaying line and color suddenly took precedence over realism in ways that reinvented the forms and styles of art to the general public. Of course, some art existed under the means of trying to work into and celebrate modernism, such as pieces like Thomas Ekinson's The Gross Clinic from 1875, which celebrated the medical achievements under modernism. But the more abstract movements that worked to go against academic standards that, for years upon years, strayed away from still lifes and degraded the use of color and rather appreciated and put focus on lines and realism and math that could be put into painting, now was being fought against with deeply personal art being made not for the turning the cogs of a capitalist machine or for a king, but for one's own personal expression. Now, Expressionism. Expressionism is a hard movement to place into just one category, but the general idea was that it existed in its style to express emotion through dramatic color and imagery, and almost a crude brushwork that created a sense of freedom and celebrated experimentation in its style that strayed so far away from academic art. This rebellion against modernism existed in forms of expressionism that were either more inwardly personal or more of a personal perspective put outwards towards greater society, which can be seen through the works of Ernst Ludwig Kirchner's Street, Berlin, 1913, and Edvard Munch's The Kiss, 1897. Let's begin with Street, Berlin by Kirchner. Ernst Ludwig Kirchner was an artist in the German Expressionist art movement and the leader of the Die Brücke movement. The Expressionists in Germany often were inspired by the Fauve images, based in Fauvism, with les Fauves meaning the wild beasts, which connected into the wild and sporadic use of color and high emotion in art that was adopted by many Expressionist artists at the time. Dramatic and emotional pieces with strong colors but also ragged lines and a sense of almost agitation in the brushstrokes was also important in this kind of art, which can be seen perfectly in this piece. The royal, expensive shades of fuchsia and purple and deep blues almost overwhelm the canvas in a way that creates a sensory overload in looking at the piece. This effect only continues with the ragged lines and harsh brushstrokes and this lack of linear perspective that is traditional to us that creates this dreamlike effect with the hypnotic nature of the winding path with no clear end behind, almost ghoulishly shaped women with claw-like hands and eyes with no clear expression. This painting creates a deep sense of drama and unease towards the luxury and perceived immorality of a scene we're sneaking in on through its color and its fashion, but also this anxiety through the deeply impersonal nature of the subjects, as not a single one of them faces the audience, making us feel the sense of being ignored by those in the piece, emphasized by the nature of the appearance of these creatures that look more fantastical than human, with their bright colors, furs and feathers, and the very form they exist in within this piece of sharp lines and untextured skin. Now, The Kiss by Edvard Munch. Munch was a symbolist, a sub-style and category within Expressionism, from Norway, who made his art with the main idea being that he felt and understood the pain of human life and believed the largest part of being human was the sense of powerlessness against the forces of death and love. Emotions of jealousy, loneliness, fear, desire, and despair were prominent themes in his work that he created. He displayed these emotions in each of his canvases through deep emotionalism in line and color to create abstract scenes of what these things felt like above what they could ever literally look like. This psychic life displayed on canvas helped set him apart in his art as his paintings worked to create an image of the distorted view of the mind. His pieces, through this psychic view inwards, almost work to create a physical reaction that seeps back into the souls of the viewers, creating the emotion it was made to express. This can be seen in his piece The Kiss through its shadowy blending of two subjects into one to create this sense of bonding and almost inescapable togetherness that love can feel like. They are shrouded in circles of darkness and shadow, with hints of color that are used to emphasize the emotion of the piece in what here feels like the both overwhelming feelings of romantic and sexual intensity, but also of deep fear. This can be seen in the small traces of red throughout the painting, a color of both love and passion, but also that of blood and death in many cases. Combining the two of them, this idea of love and despair makes it unclear what it represents, with the answer seeming to be both, displaying the contradictions and the true passion but also fear that comes along with being in love. The darkness creates a sense of dread in what is a traditionally loving idea, tying to much of the pessimism in Munch's work, with the appearance of the kiss, their faces expressionless and featureless, blending into one another, almost creating the sense of consumption, of being devoured by another person. This loss of self is a common view of the fears and terrors of love that make this piece so highly emotional. We are also drawn by the light, which peeks only from the lower corner of the room and guides us diagonally to their faces, which, once we focus on, we come to realize they are trapped there in that light, in one another, with only shadows as comfort to blanket around them. This trap of intimacy, as displayed through this piece, is truly incredible in its emotion and complexity. Now, all of these elements of Expressionism tie into the rebellion against modernism in both of these paintings, with actually quite the interesting tie between Munch and Kirchner, being the city of Berlin, with one piece representing its streets, and the other artist being a man who moved to Berlin where he laid the groundwork of Expressionism that inspired artists such as Kirchner later on. Berlin was this incredible place that created much conflict within its ideals and beliefs. Berlin, for reference, was a major world city at the time, a hub for the modernist innovation and capitalist ideals to flourish, but to be criticized too. Expressionism was often, in a way, an attempt to define a critical response to the modernist ideals of the growing Western world. Expressionism attempts to correct contradictions of freedom and forced structure of modernism through the means of abstraction and liberation of art. This, however, was often viewed in psychology as what was not really a challenge to modernism, but the exact opposite side of the same coin, only powered by narcissism, rebellious as to support its own ego through self-critical state that ends up supporting the same bourgeois of the modernists they claim to represent. And although there is merit in saying that displaying art is not always the rebellion it thinks it is, that changing how we speak will not be enough to change the world, there is a deep misunderstanding of what it means to create art in times of great change, and what art can mean to a single person, and later to many people. This is to say that perhaps the narcissism that was seen in the expressionist art, as it focused on the personal subject, the ego of the artist, wasn't a bad thing. Narcissism is a way to create one's own connection to physical objects, to reclaim them in their possession through the emotion of a singular person. This works against the very idea of modernism, the expectation that one's work, one's perspective in a way, is always owned by another, one higher than themselves. It takes the false ideals of individualism placed upon the society and makes them true in its own form of rebellion, by making loneliness of one's own soul into a painting, by making the world be seen in ghoulish figures, as that is the way one's hand began to capture them. Expressionist art is a rebellion of its own in its refusal to hold a perspective of anyone other than themselves. Now, what this meant individually to each artist tied into their either more inward inspection through painting or a more outward one. Street Berlin is a piece that has been documented as Kirchner's commentary on the excesses and immorality of city life, but also what comes to be of interest is this idea of personal pain in works of art. The Die Brücke was created truly as a response to the hypocrisy of the decadence of those in power, the luxury that was owned and exploited as workers perished in the lower levels of industrial society. There was a criticism of the impersonal nature through a sense of anxiety and emotional pieces that worked to force emotion upon those analyzing it as a response to their own place in said system. Die Brücke is named appropriately for a passage in Friedrich Nietzsche's Thus Spoke Zarathustra, that spoke of the contemporary humanity's potential to be the evolutionary bridge to a more perfect superhuman of the future, as noted by Marilyn Stockstead. This idea of the superhuman being helps to criticize modernism as a whole and how it affects and dehumanizes, creating an impersonal world that starts to see its citizens in abstract forms. It's important to note that within the industrialization of Berlin at the time, there were many conservative debates around the nature of fashion and prostitution. Harsh ideals were placed upon women that forced them to act and dress in distinct ways to avoid punishment. The societal debate around the modern lives of women inspired much of Kirchner's work, as he was fascinated with the idea of the prostitute in the city, as they worked as allies in the campaign for the liberation of instinct. This idea being that there was a high emotionality in a subject that created moral ambiguity and a society craving structure within its novel inventions and innovations. Art was made to challenge that sense of structure through its subjects, specifically feminine ones, that forced one to look at the elements of society they did and did not consider moral. With fashion's rising popularity fighting against the ideals of what made a moral woman, it forced questioning, which was something Kirchner wished to represent, as his hope was to express the inner life in the pictorial forms. In this piece, that meant displaying the fast-paced nature of city life through crowds with harsh lines, creating an image, an idea of a city through emotional means. As well, this focus on subjects less desired likely was tied into his life that in many times in Berlin were filled with an intense yearning for community, as at this time many of his friendships with artists in the movement, as well as the movement itself, were collapsing. The Die Brücke disbanded in 1913. Kirchner himself was quoted as saying, "I allowed myself to be sufficiently pervaded by the whole inner manner of these types, in order to know them from the inside out, and to be able to abandon them." This feeling of abandonment by a greater society in the modern world often worked to inspire him, as he felt the same way and worked to create the subjects in his art that he understood in his life. In a way, this display of women in their fancy clothes was a way of representing prostitutes, forcing us to understand their perspective as they refuse to look at us the way we refuse to look at them. However, it is important to note that this representation, which visually often created women as inhuman creatures, despite claims of empathy by the artist, are further overwhelmed by the modern ideals of the working woman being sinful. And by working, it often meant prostitutes. And the concept of women being split only into the wife or the prostitute was a horribly sexist ideal of the male artist that, despite their best efforts, often truly couldn't create empathy for. But empathy for women was something that, despite a deeply emotion-based form of art that was Expressionism, was still not offered. While Kirchner's work seemed to display other subjects as to create an emotional response of the eye of the viewer seeing the world around him, Munch comparatively focused on displaying a look inwards at oneself. For background, Munch had a life that from the beginning was filled with torment and pain, with an overbearing father that treated his children with military discipline after his wife died of tuberculosis, an unstable relationship with his own health that was said to have caused him images of ghosts and nightmares that created his gloomy sensibilities and made death an inextricable part of his life that only became worse when his sister died of tuberculosis, his second sister became schizophrenic and was constantly hospitalized, his brother became a doctor, and died of pneumonia, and later, while in Paris, his father died of a stroke, which only added to his trauma after a love affair in his life with a woman named Tula turned incredibly abusive, as she was noted to have threatened to kill herself to him, likely a large inspiration for the consuming nature of love he displayed in works such as The Kiss. Needless to say, Munch had a life of turmoil that he put into his art. In fact, he was quoted as saying, "My sufferings are part of myself and my art. They are indistinguishable from me, and their destruction would destroy my art. I want to keep those sufferings." This was visible in the emotional nature of his art, and to all those who experienced it. It uses the medium of painting, color and texture and lines to create pure emotion on canvas, ignoring ideals of realism and perfection in subjects. Now, how does this connect to modernism, or more specifically, this idea of expressionism as a reaction to it? In a strange and simple way, the very nature of making deeply personal art with no intention to sell it, no intention to be commissioned or hired or given any pay or celebration for one's work, is the emotional expression of the artistic spirit that went against everything the capitalist ideals of modernism encouraged. Rather, Munch enjoyed donating his pieces, almost jealous of their future to be cared for by another. Munch was known to be severely upset if people sold his art he gave to them as a gift. He wouldn't name his works and often treated them as human beings. If he didn't like a painting, he would kick, hit, trample, or curse them by putting them in the rain and dirt, hoping the picture would become better for it. To him, in a way, his paintings were alive, almost a projection of his own emotions that were able to find a home in his pieces, away from himself. And this deep personalization of art, with no intention of selling it, was the best response for one feeling far away from a modernist society, in that one making art for the sake of their own self, own ego, own emotions, to be put onto canvas as if it could hold them, was almost the perfect form of rebellion against modernism through expressionism. Art for many years focused its importance on painting important figures, such as kings, or displaying moral lessons in the history painting that was considered the highest form of art in academic schools. But this changed significantly in the modern world. When one has a more personal freedom, yet lives in a confining society of expectations and a push towards constantly moving forward, there was a radical kind of response in creating Expressionism, a movement based on using one's own perspective to pause and create an image of an emotion in a moment of time, in a sense freezing it, something disdained in a capitalist society based on continually moving forwards. This understanding of perspective, of course, worked many ways, as can be seen in the two pieces spoken of here, with Street Berlin being far more focused on Kirchner's personal perspective as he looked out and felt emotion at the world around him, while Munch worked to turn his eye inward in pieces such as The Kiss, where he created emotion on canvas that displayed a feeling, a moment, that one can truly only experience with the camaraderie of themselves. Art is cyclical in its rebellion, perhaps. As each time conformity is attempted to be put upon a society, a response occurs. Perhaps this is the most human trait of us all, to wish to be different. Certainly, this applies to creatives. For as neoclassicism arrived, as did Romanticism, as did Mannerism when the High Renaissance put the ideals of perfection just a little too high. There's a comfort in knowing that the spirit that lives within art, perhaps due to its emotional form, is so powerful, in that art is dangerous. It is a weapon and a medicine, a personal display of emotion and a callous display of wealth. It is everything and nothing and has existed since humans put crushed pigments on the walls of caves to say, "I was here." And when modernism came and attempted to sterilize society into a world in which photography could have killed the need for paintings and paintings made could have nonetheless simply been used to be sold and to make more money, movements came to push against the boundaries of society to say, "I am here to make art of my pain, to make art of my loneliness as I stare out at the street. And I make this for no one but myself. And I will freeze time destined to move forward without me because in this moment, this art belongs to me and no one else. because I was here, and I made this. Expressionists colored outside the lines in an increasingly strict world, returning to the deepest, most primitive and beautiful roots of art, of putting oneself onto the canvas, whatever it may be, in whatever way felt right. And, deeply personally, I say, good. We're always the better for it.